Hi, everyone. It is 6:30. We are going to get started shortly. We're just waiting for attendees to file into the webinar. And in the meantime, I'm going to entertain you with terrible oyster jokes. So here we go. First terrible joke. How did the oyster hide from the fish? Camouflage. Ha ha ha. How do oysters get around? In muscle cars. I kind of like that one. Why won't any sea creatures date oysters? Because they're shellfish. So there you go. Terrible oyster jokes to kick off this final webinar in our Winter Oyster webinar series. Gonna give just a few more seconds. Looks like people are still filing in. Thanks for joining us. All right, I think we've reached critical mass. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session of the Winter Oyster webinar series presented by Oyster Recovery Partnership and Mom's Organic Market. Tonight, we will be learning about how oyster restoration is accomplished in the Chesapeake Bay, everything from how sites are selected to the partners involved to what kind of monitoring takes place after a reef is completed. So I'm your host, Allison Albert Gercio. I'm the marketing manager with Oyster Recovery Partnership, and I would be remiss if I did not tell you all the incredible things that we do. So Oyster Recovery Partnership is the nonprofit expert in Chesapeake Bay oyster restoration, and we are restoring the bay's native oyster population by building sanctuary reefs, rebuilding public fishery reefs, supporting the growing oyster aquaculture or oyster farming industry, recycling oyster shell, and getting the public involved through hands-on education and events. So since our founding in 1994, and with the support of major partners like the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, Horn Point Laboratory, that one gets me every time, it's a lot of words. ORP has planted more than 9 billion oysters on 3,000 acres of underwater reef. And we've recycled more than 250,000 bushels of oyster shell. So that's a lot. There's still more work to be done, and we are here to happily take it on. So you can support us by either making a donation or shopping ours and our partners' merch on our website, designating ORP as your Amazon Smile charity. And of course, we hope that you will buy local seafood, you'll eat oysters at home, you'll eat oysters at Shell Recycling Alliance member restaurants, and of course, recycle those shells. So visit Oyster Recovery to find more info on all of those things. So first, I want to cover some quick webinar housekeeping. We are offering live captioning for this event, and you can turn it on by selecting the closed caption icon at the bottom of your screen in the webinar control panel. This broadcast is being recorded, and we will post it to YouTube afterwards so everyone can watch. Participants, your lines are muted and your cameras are turned off. Sorry about that. So please ask us questions using the Q&A feature also at the bottom in your webinar control panel. And please make an intention to submit those questions through the Q&A and not the chat, because chat can move really quickly and we might miss your question, and we definitely want to make sure that we get everyone's questions answered before the end of the webinar. So I think it is now time to meet our speakers. First, I want to introduce Jen Walters, and Jen is a coastal resource scientist here with ORP. Hey, Jen.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. You've got a long history with ORP. Why don't you tell everybody?
I do. So I worked with ORP back in 2014, 2015 when I first got out of undergrad. for just a little over a year, and then went off to grad school and moved back to Maryland and decided to come back just because I love working with everyone so much and what we do here. So it's been great.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Okay, our next presenter is Sara Coleman. Sara is also a coastal resource scientist here at ORP. Hi, Sara.
Hey, Allison. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here, giving up your Wednesday evening to teach everybody about your super cool job.
Yeah, this is the grand finale, so it's going to be a good one.
Awesome. Okay. And then next we have Nicole Schroyer, and Nicole is with our sponsor, Mom's Organic Market. Hey, Nicole.
Hey everyone. So I'm Nicole. I'm the communications coordinator at Mom's Organic Market, and I'm super excited to be here today for the last webinar in our Mom's ORP webinar series. As you may know, our purpose at Mom's is to protect and restore the environment. And we've been partners with ORP since 2014. So ORP has hosted field trips for our employees. They've received 5% of sales during our 5% donation days. And they even helped us start our own oyster farm off of Fleets Island, Virginia in 2015. And most recently in 2020, we began partnering with True Chesapeake Oyster Company to offer sustainable oysters to our customers. And as you may know, especially if you've been attending the series, oyster shells are the best material to raise new oysters on and to restore oyster reefs. So to save this ecologically important byproduct from ending up in landfills, we began partnering with ORP to offer oyster shell recycling drop-off at all of our, or most of our stores. And so, yeah, we're really proud of our efforts to grow awareness around the importance of recycling oyster shells. And it's a unique opportunity for us because customers are constantly like, why are you collecting oyster shells? You're a grocery store. And they think it's a little bit odd. So we get the opportunity to engage with them and talk to our community about oysters and why they're important and why recycling them is important. So we really are super grateful for the partnership. And since 2019, we've collected over 16,000 shells at our stores. And in 2020, we collected 2,200 shells, which is enough shells to provide a home to over 22,000 spat or baby oysters to grow. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Allison, and thanks again for having me.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nicole. We truly can't do the work that we do without incredible partners like Moms, and we are so, so grateful for their support. So I just want to mention one other hardworking ORP staff member who is behind the scenes tonight, and that's Kaylee Fleury. She's our events and marketing associate, and she is here. You won't see her, but she's here to make sure things run smoothly. And we really appreciate her help. So round of applause for Kaylee. Okay, so we're gonna kick things off with a poll. We wanna see how much you already know about the oyster restoration process. So you should see a window up on your screen, there it is. So this is a multiple choice question, unlike if you've attended the other webinars, they were single choice. So the question is around our partners and how the partners who are involved. So your answer options are UMSI's Horn Point Lab, the Army Corps, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and NOAA. So who do you think our restoration partners are? I love it. I love polls. It's so cool to see the answers come in. We've got 60% participation. Come on, guys, don't be scared. There we go. Getting warmer. 76. All right. I think we've got the participation that we're going to get. So let's go ahead and in the poll and share those results. And oh, I neglected to mention that we have one really great prize for a lucky winner tonight. And that's a $50 gift card to Moms and a little bit of ORP swag, a hat or a t-shirt of your choosing. And I will announce that randomly selected winner at the end of the presentation, right before Q&A. You must be present to win, so please stick around. And let's go ahead and share those poll results. It looks like they're there. Okay, so the correct answer is all of these entities are restoration partners with ORP in accomplishing Chesapeake Bay oyster restoration. So that was a little tricky, but it looks like you guys are pretty informed about who's involved in oyster restoration and who's helping us. So way to go. All right. So without further ado, I want to bring Jen Walters back on screen, and I am going to let Jen, oh wait, sorry. Did we get our poll results on there? I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm doing. These dang polls. Okay. So Jen, are you there? Awesome. There you are.
Can you hear me? Yes, great.
I sure can. Okay, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Allison, for the introduction. As she mentioned, my name is Jen Walters, and I work with the Oyster Recovery Partnership. I'm a coastal resource scientist at the organization. And I just want to start first off by thanking you all for attending tonight. Hopefully you learn a lot. And again, as Allison mentioned, make sure to ask your questions in the Q&A feature and stick around at the end, because Sarah and I will be speaking tonight, and we'll make sure at the end to answer any questions that you have, or as many as we can. So what we'll be talking about tonight, I'm going to go back to the previous 2 webinars in this series and just do a little bit of refresher. If you attended them, or if not, you'll get a brief overview of what we talked about then, about how oysters are a keystone species, really their importance in the ecosystem and why we care so much about them. And then talk about some of the threats that are facing those oysters, and then go into what we do at ORP to really make sure we are restoring the population of oysters to what it used to be, or as close as we can, to make sure that we're getting as many of those keystone species out there. So really just putting more oysters in the water. I will then hand it over to Sara Coleman, who works with me at ORP, and she will talk a little bit more in detail about how that restoration project or process works, and you know, how we create those oysters that we're putting back out into the bay. So with that, we'll move into the next slide. All right, so in the first webinar, if you attended in the series, we talked about how oysters not only are a great food source for, of course, you know, us humans and other species in the environment, but other characteristics that they have that really make them that keystone species and super important to us. So with that, the oysters attach to one another and create this 3D structure. So they create all these crevices in between them that really makes great habitat for juvenile or smaller species in the bay that serves as great protection for them. And then in addition to the habitat for those smaller species, you can see, of course, larger species such as Maryland striped bass or white perch, things that, you know, people look forward to coming to Maryland to fish for. They have then a food source to go feed on. So it really creates this bigger ecosystem picture. Not only do they, you know, create habitat, but they are known to filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. So oysters, as a bivalve species, will filter the water over their tissues in order to feed. They'll take in the nutrients that they need as food, but then also take some of those excess nutrients out of the water column or sediment and things like that. So you might have seen the video, the side-by-side in the first webinar, showing a tank of oysters in pretty dirty water, and then a tank of the same dirty water without oysters, and just showing a time lapse really of how much oysters really work to clean the water quality. In addition to that, they really help with coastal resiliency. So we talked a little bit in the second webinar, and I'll go into that a little bit more, about things with climate change. So oysters are great. They provide that reef structure similar to a coral reef, with really decreasing wave attenuation or any wave activity and preventing erosion along the shoreline. So they're doing all of these great benefits and are really important for us to make sure we're sustaining that population or restoring it to its previous levels. All right. So some of the threats we talked about to oysters in that second webinar series, in addition to climate change. So over the last several decades, oysters have really declined in population due to overharvest, disease, and things that we're now facing are things like climate change. So with sea level rise and ocean acidification, and talked about a little bit about how the decrease or the decline in pH in the water or in the bay can really cause decalcification of the shells and cause those shells to dissolve. So all of those impacts degraded water quality, so they can filter a ton of nutrients, but when it becomes an excess of that, it's hard for them to really keep up. Also, there's a loss of habitat. So with all of these factors, overharvest and things like that, there's a lack of shell. Oysters need a hard substrate to attach onto in their larval phase in order to become a spat or a baby oyster and then grow. So with a lack of oysters, a lack of shell out there, they're really unable to then reproduce. So you can imagine, oysters that are spread out aren't going to be close enough to reproduce with one another, and then also aren't going to have that hard substrate to settle on and then grow and sustain that population. So with the next slide, what do we do at ORP to combat all of this? Sounds really negative. We talked about how oysters are a great species. So at ORP, our main goal is to get more oysters out into the bay. We do that in several different assets, working with various different industries. One of our main goals is going to be putting oysters on sanctuary bottom. So sanctuaries, as defined, are areas in the bay that are then closed for harvest so that we can ensure that nothing is taken out of there and they are growing the population, allowing for reproduction to happen and kind of have a spillover effect into other tributaries. We understand we're not going to take harvest completely away. We also work with the public fishery and aquaculture industries as well. So with the public fishery, we'll talk a little bit about that. We have worked over the last several years to enhance the bottom that the commercial industry is working and harvesting to ensure that that is sustained every year. Aquaculture is a rapidly growing industry with a lot of people that are newly coming into the industry or some commercial watermen transitioning into that industry. And we want to make sure that we are supporting that industry as well and ensuring that is continuing to grow because it's going to be what is sustainable for the future. I'll then touch on some smaller projects that we do, such as the Maryland Grow Oyster program and the Build a Reef program as well. That kind of gets more of the community involved on a smaller scale, but still additionally puts more oysters out into the bay, which is our main focus. All right, so like I said, and as Allison mentioned, we have put over 9 billion oysters into the bay. So we can't do that alone. Part of our name is partnership, the Oyster Recovery Partnership. So, and as you saw in the poll, we work with all of these great agencies to really make sure those goals are accomplished. The University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, or Horn Point, is right there in Cambridge alongside our shell facility. And what they are doing is producing the larvae that we then use to set on the shell that we get through some of our programs and put oysters out in, so we're able to put those oysters out into the bay. DNR, Army Corps of Engineers, and NOAA are a crucial point in, or crucial aspect into going out there and ground truthing or seeing what the bottom looks like on a lot of these sanctuary reefs and determining what level of restoration is really needed and helping us or provide the funding so that we can put those oysters out into the bay. We also work with companies or organizations like the Nature Conservancy. Recently, I'll talk a little bit about how we worked with them in the last year to do some aid and support to the aquaculture industry. And then also companies like NRCS or the Department of Ag's NRCS program to also aid the aquaculture industry. And all of these great agencies, but throughout all of our programs at ORP, we are continuously working with industry, whether it is to support them in plantings to make sure the public fishery and aquaculture industries are sustained, or hiring them for projects that we do with our sanctuary plantings as well. So they're a crucial part of what we do always. So as I mentioned, one of our main overarching goals at ORP is to plant oysters on sanctuary bottom. So there are over 50 sanctuaries in the Maryland portion of the Chesapeake Bay. In 2014, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement was enacted. The legislature was enacted to form the Chesapeake Bay program and make sure that there are 10 tributaries that are sanctuaries that we have focus on to make sure that they are restored by 2025. So 5 tributaries in Maryland and another 5 in Virginia. So we have this partnership with that. So you can see some examples of pictures on the screen of restoration efforts that are done throughout other areas in the country, or even, in the world. But the main goal is, of course, with sanctuaries, that they are closed for harvest to make sure that we are allowing some populations of oysters to grow and, like I said before, reproduce and be self-sustaining. And in addition to enhancing the areas that are harvested as well. So that is the main point of our sanctuary bottom in Maryland. So we also work with the aquaculture industry, as I said. With one of the main projects and one of the longest projects we've kind of been doing is our remote setting program. So we at ORP help anybody that is new trying to get into the industry really start up, providing them the training and introduction that they would need to get into the aquaculture industry. There's a lot of people that are new into the industry, and there's a lot of people that are from the commercial industry that are transitioning to aquaculture because they realize they want to still do what they love to do, and they realize it might be more sustainable. So with the remote setting program, we provide that training, some decreased rates to make it a little bit more affordable for them, so we can try to ensure more people are getting into that industry. In this past year, we partnered with the Nature Conservancy on a project called SOAR, where we, during the decline in the market for the aquaculture industry, we helped, because of all the restaurant closures, we helped to not only purchase oysters from the aquaculture industry to really help balance out that decline in market that they lost, and use those oysters to then plant them on sanctuary reefs. So we kind of got 2 benefits in one, helping support the industry and then also making sure those oysters go back out into the bay. With one of our other programs, NRCS, we work with the Department of Ag. So they help provide funding to plant oysters and shell on aquaculture lease bottom. And then we help do the verification to make sure that those reefs down the road or years later are creating better habitat, and that reef is building and doing those benefits that we talked about earlier, improving the water quality, creating habitat and things like that. So those are just some examples of how we work with the aquaculture industry to, again, get more oysters out into the bay. All right. So I talked a little bit about the public fishery. We work with 11 different counties in Maryland to plant shell, seed, and spat on shell, which Sara will talk a little bit more about, on public oyster bars. So the counties designate what bars they want to ensure are being sustainable and enhanced so that they can go back and harvest them. So any declines in the population on those reefs from their continued harvest is then being supplemented and enhanced by additional plantings each year. So, and then smaller programs, like I mentioned, with Maryland Grow Oysters, allow the community to get more involved. So with Maryland Grow Oysters, we allow any residents in the county of Maryland to grow spat on shell or oysters at their dock and watch them grow, and then collectively bring them together to plant those oysters on sanctuary bottom. There's other efforts such as Build a Reef, where you can see in this picture, where the community is coming together to develop that funding to do the same thing, put oysters out on sanctuary bottom, and again, just enhance the oyster population. All right, so with that, that was just a brief overview of, how we at ORP are involved in making sure we can support all the aspects or industries in the oyster world of Maryland. And Sara is going to talk a little bit more in detail about how that restoration process works. So I will transition it over to Sara.
All right, thanks, Jen. So oyster restoration in Maryland can be a little bit tricky based on the limited recruitment that we see naturally, but I'm going to walk us through how ORP's restoration process works. We begin by collecting shell, identifying areas that we'd like to restore, producing spat on shell with the help of Horn Point, planting and constructing reefs, and then following up with post-restoration monitoring. So ORP's Shell Recycling Alliance has been collecting shell free of charge since 2010. Since then, we've kept over 9,000 tons of shell out of area landfills. We currently collect shell from hundreds of restaurants, 70 public drop sites, and various events and festivals throughout the year. Shell is stored on the Eastern Shore and aged for at least 1 year prior to being used in restoration, and this lets any organic material be decayed and removed by sun and rain. You can see the little graphic here on the right that shows something we provide to restaurants. And this allows patrons to see that the oyster on their plate is going on to serve a larger purpose. But even with all of this recycled shell, we sometimes need to supplement with shell from shucking houses in Virginia or North Carolina. Shell is a really scarce resource. In fact, as early as the 1920s, there were laws put into place to preserve this resource. One being that shucking houses in Maryland had to return at least 1/10 of their shells to the state. Oyster shells can be used for other purposes like road materials or chicken feed. And so it was really crucial for the state to realize that we needed to hold on to this resource to go back into the water and create more oysters. So the next step is identifying areas that we'd like to restore. We select tributaries based on water quality data, current oyster habitat, sanctuary status, and public support. Once we've zoned in on a river that we'd like to work in, the next step is creating what we call a tributary blueprint. We use existing spatial data and consider depth, typically focusing in on areas between 4 and 20 feet deep, bottom type, location of historic oyster bars called Yates bars, proximity to navigational channels, docks, seagrass beds, aquaculture leases, and any other uses. So you can see here some of our partners using sonar technology to create some of these spatial data sets that we use. Once we have all this information, we can go in and select the reef areas or polygons that we'd like to restore. And this also allows us to develop cost estimates for projects and aids in the permitting process. Oyster restoration requires firm bottom. We don't want to be planting spat-on shell in mud that will just sink right down to the bottom and die. So sometimes we also conduct ground truthing surveys in order to update our information and validate whatever the desktop data analysis has shown. This allows us to get current information on the population and have really fine-scale data on where we'd like to restore. So creating the spat-on shell could not be done without our partnership with the Horn Point Lab. Starting early in the year, adult oysters known as broodstock are brought into the lab to begin the conditioning process. This is where the water temperature is slowly warmed, basically to trick the oysters into spawning earlier in the year than they normally would. Oysters typically spawn in Maryland from June through August, but we want to jumpstart that process so that we can plant all summer long. It takes about 2 months for oysters to become ripe enough to spawn. So for this year, the hatchery staff are hoping to begin our spawns in the next couple of weeks. Once spawning begins, hatchery staff can separate the oysters based on sex. So they actually spawn in different ways. Males emit a steady stream of sperm from the side of their shell, while females can clap their valves about every 30 seconds to release a puff of eggs. Hatchery staff then collect these gametes and use a microscope to count the eggs and then determine how much sperm should be added to create the larvae. Once the eggs are fertilized, they're transferred to tanks with ambient seawater for 3 days to swim around and eat algae that's also created and cultured at the lab. Every few days during this, these big tanks will be drained, the larvae are caught on fine mesh sieves, and then the hatchery staff can look at them, see how they're growing, and decide if they need more time. Around 14 days, the tanks will be drained and the larvae will be almost ready to be set. So the staff at the hatchery are looking for a well-developed foot and an eye spot to determine if it's time for the larvae to go into the setting tanks with clean shell. Once they are added, that's the picture up on the right with the hatchery manager staff adding some larvae outside on the pier. 48 hours later, the hatchery staff will check and see if the larvae have settled and successfully become spat. And if so, then the ambient seawater is turned on and water from the Choptank River is pumped into the tanks. So on the, just gonna go over these photos. On On the left side here, we have a little clump of oyster larvae ready to go into a tank. And then on the bottom right is spat on shell with lots of little spat on there. You can see some of the red arrows, and that's what it typically looks like when we go ahead and plant. So it's finally time to plant the reef. But before receiving spat on shell, some areas might require additional substrate to create a firm and stable reef base. So this is when we can partner with the Department of Natural Resources and the Army Corps of Engineers to deploy substrate like granite, fossil shell, or mixed shell. This is more expensive than planting directly on the bottom, but it's ensuring that these reefs are going to be successful. We also contract with local watermen and their vessels to conduct the plantings. So you can see the picture on the left there. Planting day at the hatchery begins bright and early. The setting tanks are drained and these stainless steel cages are removed from the tanks with a crane. Each tank holds 8 cages, which can hold 20 bushels, and we can deploy up to 2,400 bushels of spat on shell at a time. Then once the vessel is loaded, it navigates to the planned restoration site using ArcGIS, a mapping program, and we can also track the vessel's path as it deploys spat on shell in real time, so we know exactly where the material is going down. You can see there one of our contractors, one of our partners, Tommy, blasting the spat on shell off the deck with a fire hose. It's also important that the hatchery collect a subsample of the shells before we deploy them. They can then count and determine the set rate of a tank and how many baby oysters we just planted. We often assume about 1 million spat per tank. And last year we planted over 700 million spat on shell and completed the 3rd large-scale tributary in Maryland. After restoration, we like to follow up on sites that have been planted using a couple of different gears to see how the oysters are doing and see if they're going to be successful in the long run. So in the big 5 tributaries, which are Harris Creek, Little Choptank, Tridavon, St. Mary's, and the Minokin, we sample every 3 and 6 years to make sure that the reefs are sustaining and meeting success metrics. This past fall, we monitored about 260 acres of oyster reef. We do this by excavating the surface of the reef and bringing everything up to the boat, where we then count and measure all the living and dead oysters. We also look at the amount of substrate or clean oyster shell that's available for new oysters to set on, fouling organisms and other species that might be living on the reef, and also the black shell, which means that that oyster had been buried in anoxic mud. We also monitor control sites, which are nearby unrestored natural bars, so that we can understand what's happening to the baseline oyster population. If the densities that we monitor are low or we see lots of mortality in a particular year, we have the option of supplementing reefs with a second seeding, and this would happen in year 4. We have a target of 50 oysters per square meter for all of our reefs to be at by year 6. So we can always add a little bit more if we think a reef isn't doing so well. In addition to density, we're looking at a few other success metrics. We want to see reefs maintain a stable or increasing spatial extent, reef height, and shell budget, and have multiple year classes present. So ideally, we'd like to see tiny spat, larger juveniles, and larger spawning adults on a reef. So I hope by this 3rd webinar, we've given you a good idea of just how amazing oysters are, and maybe you've come to love them almost as much as we do. But given all of the benefits that oyster reefs can provide, it's clear that bringing back this species is a really worthwhile goal for the Bay to help create more resilient communities and a resilient system, not just for people, but for nature as well. With that, I think we will move into the Q&A. I think you're muted, Allison.
Thank you.
There you go.
3rd time's a charm, right? There we go. So this is the point in the webinar where we show our appreciation for our two presenters, Sara and Jen. It's not easy to get on camera and speak to an audience that doesn't really seem to be there. So I just want to give them a big round of applause and say thank you. And I hope that you guys will also chat them some words of encouragement in our chat window. So before we dive into the Q&A, I want to announce our giveaway winner. And that person is Monica Relman. I apologize if I mispronounced your name, but Monica, congratulations. Thank you so much for attending tonight. We will contact you to follow up on your $50 Mom's gift card and your ORP swag. So congratulations. And now we've got some time with Sara and Jen for Q&A, and it looks like we've got some good questions queued up here. So I'm just gonna dive right in and take the first question first. So this is from Rick Thompson, and the question is, how does the oyster restoration process in the Chesapeake Bay compare to others in areas such as Virginia, New England, New York, California, and Washington State?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I mentioned a little bit that we sometimes struggle with natural recruitment in Maryland, meaning that our oyster reefs are not always seeding themselves, and that's why we use spat on shell. So that's a process that's used in a few other places, including New England and parts of New York. But some states like Virginia and North Carolina are a little bit luckier. Saltier water means that there's typically more larval availability. And so those reefs are just built with blank recycled oyster shells or other substrate, and then they are seeded naturally. And what's really cool is even in some places in the Gulf, they don't use oyster shell at all. They might sink things like porcelain or old cars to create artificial reefs, and they still seem to attract a lot of oysters and create a healthy system.
All right, fantastic. Okay, our next question is about concrete reef balls, which is not something that we do a lot of work with, but hopefully one of you can still answer this question. So the question is, how well do concrete reef balls allow for attachment of spat?
Like Allison said, we don't really work with them, particularly at ORP, and maybe Sara can speak on it more. But in general, like Sara just mentioned, a lot of other substrates, in addition to oyster shell, are used in different areas. We even use or utilize different substrates other than just oyster shell here, as Sara mentioned, using granite and things like that. Really, oysters just want to attach to a hard substrate. So, I mean, the concrete will do great. Like we said, in monitoring, we see a variety of, debris and trash that's out there as well that the oysters will set on. So it's definitely something with the lack of oyster shell recently that we've, come across as an issue in continuing to do our restoration, looking at different options for substrate. I mean, we see anything from cell phones to sunglasses to power cords, anything like that. So they will attach to that if that substrate is there for sure.
Great. Okay. Look, we're getting more questions. This is exciting. Okay. So I'm going to save this top question. Okay. So can you explain what you mean by hard bottom? And does that include sand?
Yes, that is a very good question. It does include sand, but the thing with sand is that it's often indicative of a higher energy area. So we have to be careful about placing oysters and shell in a place where it might just be, wiped away by storms or wave energy. But typically we're looking for sandy bottom. We don't want to, like I said, place oysters on mud or really soft, fine sediments like that. What we'd really like to find is remnant shell, and that could be shell that had been previously placed by the state maybe, or naturally occurring oyster shell. But typically, yeah, we're looking for more coarser grain sediments like sand when we are doing restoration.
Okay, great. And then, I love this question. Okay. Do oysters help with the habitat of other animals and plants?
Definitely. We talked about that a little bit in our first webinar of the series, and I briefly touched on it. But while we're out there doing the monitoring, you're not only going to see, you know, macroalgae and different plant species that are growing on those oysters, but you're going to find critters in all those like crevices that you see, especially in this picture. So you can see mussels and barnacles on there, but then you'll also find in the crevices of the oysters specifically, little mud crabs, juvenile blue crabs, things like that. We refer to a dead oyster that is still attached at the hinge of the shell as a box. So you can imagine that's like a little house for any kind of fish species like gobies, blennies, skillet fish, oyster toadfish, things like that. So we find those different species of worms, all different species, utilizing the oyster reef as habitat.
Ooh, I just want to throw in a heads up that tomorrow is World Wildlife Day, and we will be celebrating all of the incredible species that oyster reefs house on World Wildlife Day. Okay, this next question is kind of long, so I'm going to break it up into some parts. But Ryan Brown is curious about the selection of the restoration sites and what is deemed, you know, a top or a critical area, and what agencies do we work with for the permitting process needed for each location?
Yeah, that is a good question. So like I mentioned, we do a lot of our restoration work in sanctuaries because we know that those areas will be protected. And we've talked a little bit about our partners, but in addition to working with the State Department of Natural Resources and the Army Corps, we might need to work with the Coast Guard or the National Marine Fisheries Service if we're going to be conducting some restoration in an area that might be navigable waters or essential fish habitat. We often run into issues with time of year. So we want to make sure that we are going to be conducting our work during a time that isn't going to be damaging to any other natural system like seagrass or salt marsh. So there's a lot of players involved and there's a lot of permitting. So yeah, I feel hopefully I answered that.
You did great. Okay. And then the second part of that question is related to, I think, shell recycling. Have you found any better means other than 1 year dry curing process, which could speed, you know, that process along? And that I wish Tommy was here. Tommy, our shell recycling manager, is celebrating his honeymoon.
I was going to say, yeah, Tommy Price is definitely your contact on that question. There are some interesting new technologies out there and ways to sanitize shell. So one of the concerns, in addition to getting rid of all of that organic material, is that we don't want to be transplanting any disease or invasive species when we put the shells back in the water. And so that's why we typically are only going to use oysters from Maryland, or we need to apply for permits to use oyster shells from other areas. So I think there's steam shucking might be one of the ways, or even UV light. But yes, reach out to Tommy Price at ORP for all shell things.
Okay. So this is an aquaculture related question, and it's, do we assist with aquaculture site selection and or lease applications? And while we're answering that, I'm going to try to find that Citing Tool link to share with this person.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest. That'd be great. So they actually, they do that all throughout DNR. So on DNR, there is a tool on there that allows them to, you know, it's a citing tool. It allows them to, you know, kind of designate where they would like their lease to be and apply for that permit through them. There's also, because oysters and the sale of oysters, there's a lot of permitting that goes through the federal government side of things as well. But no, we don't facilitate at that point. We more so help them really get into the industry and, you know, help them plant more oysters or support that industry on the later end of things once they already have their lease.
Okay. Maybe one of my ORP colleagues who's attending this webinar can find that citing tool and throw it in the chat for people. I was not able to find it. Hey, there it is. Great job. Thanks, Olivia. Okay. So we've only got about 4 more minutes, and I'm gonna ask this question from Kristin Connolly because I think it's really interesting and I'm curious to hear the answer. So what is the net gain or loss in the oyster population in the bay each year when you include all the harvesting and farming? Can you answer that? Can one of you answer that? That's a doozy.
That's a big question. I don't know. I don't know that I could answer that. Sarah, no, putting her on the spot.
Well, I was going to say, when we plant spat on shell, like I mentioned, we're doing millions and millions at a time, but we don't expect all of those spat to make it. There's a lot of mortality, especially in the first year. So that is a very tough question. And I like Kristin's mind there, but no, I have not done the accounting.
So Kristin, we'll see if we can do some digging and maybe send some information in webinar 3 follow-up email. But thanks for prompting thanks for prompting us with such a great question.
A great idea for our future projects and research and more monitoring. So
there you go. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. This is the official wrap up of our winter oyster webinar series. We truly appreciate your support and that you were willing to show up on a Wednesday evening once every 3 weeks. We especially appreciate our sponsor, Mom's Organic Market, and we hope to work with them to produce some more webinars in the future. So you may have more interesting, cool oyster topics to learn about in the fall or the winter of later this year. So thank you again. Have a wonderful evening, and planting season starts in April. So you'll be hearing plenty of exciting news from us in the future. Be sure to follow us on social media at Oyster Recovery. Have a good night. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.